Crusader church in the heart of the Jewish quarter. It is now the Jerusalem Jewish Information Center. The prophet Isaiah predicted that someday, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah u'davar Hashem miYerushalayim, that Torah will go out of Zion and the word of God from Jerusalem. The Talmud, Ta'anit 1:5, says that God himself will not dwell in Jerusalem of heaven, upstairs, until he dwells in Jerusalem of earth, downstairs. In our days, we've been privileged to see the restoration of Jerusalem downstairs. The beautiful Jerusalem of gold emerges daily from the hills of Jerusalem. Along with it, we see God's Spirit re-emerging, God's presence in Jerusalem. Great souls, inspired by Torah from all over the world, come to live here, experience what's happening, and teach it to others. As our modest contribution to this process, we are presenting lectures and happenings on video so that they can be shared by kindred spirits all over the world. Please enjoy this presentation.
Talk about the miracle of Hanukkah. I'm going through a kind of personal miracle today. That a Bezek truck drove up to my house, and they said that they're going to put in a phone. Now, I want to explain to you the miraculous nature of this event, because it's important. It's important for us to be able to sort of like take note of the small miracles that happen in their daily lives. So yesterday I found out, I received information about why I would never get a phone. Ever. From Bezek. Bezek, yesterday, explained to me why I could never get a phone, and it was because in the place that I moved to, there's no official address. And the computer is incapable of instructing anybody to go to put in a phone in a home that hasn't got an address. Which actually seems to me to be quite reasonable. What do I want from the computer? So yesterday I sort of resigned myself to never getting a phone. I was working on it, like yoga or something. And I sort of like came to peace with the fact that I would not ever get a phone, and that was what was needed, apparently. That energy was missing in the world, because as soon as I got to the point where I could put up with not having a phone, they arrived. So I guess that if any of you have similar problems, this is apparently the way it works. Now I would like to talk to you about the miracle of Hanukkah. Now, I'd like to talk about it in a particular way. First, I want us to focus our attention on the fact that there is a world of difference between the way we look at Hanukkah, the way religious people who are Shomrei Mitzvot look at Hanukkah, and the way others who are also dedicated to the notion of Hanukkah but are not Shomrei Mitzvot look at it. And here in Israel, the polarity between these two positions is very clear. After all, when Hanukkah approaches, what do we think about? Where's the menorah? And where are those little glass things that we had last year? And did we remember to clean them, or did we just put them away, thinking that the grease would disappear somehow by itself? And did we buy oil with all the possible hashgachos, right, for Hanukkah? And do we have the special ptilot or ptiliot that are sent out in the mail by some institution? That's what we think about. We think about lighting the Hanukkah menorah first, and then when that's done, maybe we have to plan also making, latkes with grease. But you understand that somehow that's also connected to the idea of lighting a Hanukkah menorah, so that we focus very much on the miracle of Chanukah. And if we are students, we're also directed to focus our attention to questions like, why do we celebrate Hanukkah 8 days? And how many days was the miracle? The famous question that the Beit Yosef asked, if there was enough oil for 1 day, then the miracle was only 7 days, so why do I light candles 8 days? Bechlal, even if the miracle was 8 days, why do we celebrate Hanukkah more than 1 day? I mean, 1 day would also be enough. The whole idea of Persum Hanes, of announcing and spreading the word that there was a miracle on Hanukkah, is for some of us, especially if we live in places that we didn't live in last year, we have to make these kinds of decisions of where we're going to put our Hanukkah menorah, who's going to light it, how is it going to be lit. I mean, if everybody who studies or prepares himself for Hanukkah, or herself for Hanukkah, is preparing him or herself for dealing with the memory of the miracle that took place in Hanukkah. And we know, but we don't note so well, the fact that the miracle was only the last or the culmination of a series of events that happened in history, which was very, very significant for the Jewish people. There was an attempt by the Greek oppressors to deny the Jewish people spiritual freedom. Now, this was done in a variety of ways. They denied them the opportunity to do certain mitzvot. They tried to deny them the opportunity to study Torah. They tried to oppress them economically and in other ways. And as a result, a war was waged. A war in which there were real heroes, the family of the Hashmonaim. There were real military victories of great significance in the history of warfare, or the history of wars in the Western world. And as a result of these wars, a kingdom was set up, a kingship by Jews, for Jews in Eretz Yisrael, which lasted several hundreds of years. I mean, that's what happened. And there was a miracle. I mean, the whole thing is a miracle. The whole thing is remarkable in any event, but there was also a miracle. And so though we are aware of the fact that there is history to Chanukah, our energy is directed and concentrated very much on our response to the miracle. And I'll get back to that shortly. But you know that if you listen to the radio around Hanukkah time, or if you watch television, or if you follow the newspapers and note the different kinds of meetings that are taking place around Israel discussing Hanukkah, you might see that the University of Tel Aviv is organizing a symposium which is concerned with the effects of the military victory at the time of the Hashmonaim. Great concern in the state of Israel, in the amongst secular people, in order to understand and to come to grips with the way the war was fought, how victory was gained, what meaning that might have to us living in Israel. After all, we're a beleaguered state, we're always at war. And there seems to be some kind of chasm that's created between those people who look at history and say, even if there was the miracle in the Beit HaMikdash, that miracle was only a small and incidental part of the great events of Hanukkah. And those Jews, who we number ourselves as part of, those Jews who say, well, there was the miracle. That's what there really was. And if you say there was also a war, say, all right, there was also a war, there was a victory, very fine, but the miracle of Hanukkah. And in fact, The strangeness of this situation, I think, is in the fact that the miracle of Hanukkah, the fact that the oil burned for 8 days, when there was only enough oil for 1 day, that actual miracle is kind of irrelevant, or might be seen as being an irrelevant event religiously, because we know that God can make oil burn 8 days, or 10 days, or 30 days. I mean, what sort of information did I gain from the miracle of Hanukkah? I mean, what did I learn? I mean, isn't it much more significant that the Jewish people were willing to fight for spiritual freedom? Isn't that what we should be talking about? Isn't it true that the fact that people were willing to go out and take a stand against terrible odds for the Torah, and they were able to win victory, military victory? I mean, isn't this something that represents to us what the Jews should be all about? I mean, does the fact that God could make oil burn for 8 days, is that something that strikes us as being so completely wonderful that that's what remains? That's what we think about, that's what we're doing? And what did we think? What did we think? We thought that God who could create the world could not make the oil burn for 8 days. Or God who made the sea split could not make the oil burn for 8 days. I mean, there seems to be some sort of strangeness in this emphasis that we have placed on the matter of the miracle of the oil. Well, actually, the miracle of the oil is only the culmination. It's sort of a present that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Bnei Yisrael. After Bnei Yisrael was deemed worthy, they worked so hard to maintain the Torah in the world. And they went to the Beit HaMikdash, they wanted to light the candelabrum, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them a present. And that present is that the oil burned for 8 days. But that's not what happened on Hanukkah. What happened on Hanukkah was that the Jewish people had the strength of mind to fight for a spiritual position. And it's true that in Al Nisim we mentioned the fact that there was a war, but as I said before, our concern is primarily for the miracle and for spreading the news of the miracle. When it seems to me that we have perhaps misconstrued the central point of Hanukkah. Now, I want to tell you a halacha. An interesting thing. The Shulchan Aruch, Hilchos Chanukah, Siman Taf Reish Ayin, the very first siman of Hilchot Chanukah. The Mechaber, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writes as follows: B'Kafhei B'Kislev, Chet Yemei Chanukah, or Matchilim Chet Yemei Chanukah, the 25th day of Kislev, the 8 days of Chanukah begin. V'asurim b'espeit v'ta'anit. On those days, it is forbidden for us to mourn, or to fast, or to speak words of hesped, aval mutarim b'asiyat malacha. But we're allowed to do malacha. We're allowed to work on those days, because Chanukah is not one of the days that the Torah told us is forbidden in asiyat malacha and doing various kinds of work. Okay? Opening statement, the beginning of Hilchot Chanukah, the very first thing that he teaches us is, the Chanukah is 8 days. Now, you know what the second thing that the Shulchan Aruch teaches us about Chanukah is? The second thing, it's right there, the first line in the Shulchan Aruch. Nohagot hanashim shelo lasot milacha בעוד שהנרות דולקות. Women, however, have accepted upon themselves a chumrah, a special halacha, that they have accepted a minhag not to do melacha, not to work, as long as the candles are lit. Now, this minhag that women have accepted upon themselves has in fact come down in the halacha in various forms. There are various forms, but that doesn't interest me. What interests me is that the Shulchan Aruch takes note of the fact that women have accepted upon themselves a special limitation not to do malacha while the nerot are daluk, and does not tell us why. However, the various commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, and the various sources from which the Shulchan Aruch has put together this information, indicate that there are several reasons that women have accepted upon themselves this limitation. And one of the most famous of them is that women have a very special chelik. They have a very special portion in the Chanukah celebration, because Yehudit, remember the Yehudit? Yehudit was the one who saved the Jewish people, in fact, in a very special way. And since she did what she did, the women, in order to kind of announce that this is not just men and women together in the regular way, but somehow women are connected in a special way to this event through Yehudit, so they say, we, the women, are taking upon ourselves a special limitation. We don't do the malacha, we don't do any work while the candles are lit. Now this is a pretty remarkable statement. I mean, you remember the story of Yehudit and Holofernes, right? You remember that story? It's reminiscent of other stories, but it's a story about a woman, the daughter of the Kohen Gadol, and there was a siege of the Greeks, and she went out, and she got, she managed to get invited into the home of the chief of staff, and she fed him milchika food, which everybody agrees, weakens the mind or something. And then she made him tired, and then she gave him wine to drink, and he drank the wine, and he went to sleep, and she cut off his head and ran around and showed everybody that he was dead, and the army ran away, right? This is like not this this story has been told more or less about other women, right? You remember the story of Yael Eshet Cheva Hakeni, right? I mean, generally women are not seen as being, the physical equals of men, like a standoff wrestling match. So in order for the women to do in the men, they have to feed them or something and put them to sleep. So Yehudit followed this, ancient tradition, and in fact, there are sources that glorify Yehudit to say she was very beautiful, and she was very pious, and she was very earnest, and she was very, and she had a little base medrash of women, and she was like very remarkable, and she did this. So the women, so I can understand. This is the Kolbo in the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, it's sort of in the Shulchan Aruch. It's in the Ran, in the Gemara and Shabbos, the Shulti Giborim. It was like, it's a pretty well-known thing that the women have taken upon themselves certain limitations on Chanukah, vis-a-vis Melacha, because of Yehudit, and they're sort of saying, listen, we're celebrating Chanukah. The women are saying to the men, well, I mean, I guess there's no one else to say it to, but I mean, those are the only two legitimate groups, the women and the men. So the women are saying to the men, look, we're going to celebrate Chanukah with you. I mean, that's all right, but we want you to know that we're also celebrating Chanukah on our own, because not only are we in the general Hanukkah, like the Hanukkah about the Hashmonaim and Matityahu, right? But that was all, that was the male chauvinist Hanukkah. And so we're in there, like, we women, we were making soup back home while the Hashmonaim were out fighting the battle. So we also get a chelek, right? But we have our own Hanukkah. We have our own thing. We do our thing too. What's our thing? We don't do malacha. We're frummer than you men are. You men, you're like lighting the candles all over the world, or running around, going to work, coming home, never making it on time, but we are not doing malacha while the candles are being read. And the reason, or a reason, not the only reason, but a reason that is given the halacha is because Yehudit, after all, she was also the savior of the Jewish people. Now this whole story has an interesting aspect to it. And that is that you know, and I know, and the Shulchan Aruch knows, that Yehudit has nothing to do with Hanukkah. I mean, it's just another story about somebody saving the Jewish people. It was a wonderful miracle. It was an extraordinary event. But what exactly does it have to do with Hanukkah? What exactly does it have to do with Hanukkah? And why is it that the women have this concern on Hanukkah of saying, we want to make sure that you know that there was another miracle. Something else happened. There was another victory. There was another remarkable event when one woman all by herself changed the course of Jewish history. Because had she not done what she did, then Holofernes would have attacked and captured and destroyed, and maybe the Jewish history would have ended at that time. And just as the Hashmonaim prevented the spiritual destruction of Am Yisrael by going out and fighting a battle against the Greeks, but they needed a lot of guys to do it, we women, we did exactly the same thing, but we did it, with a little chokhmah. One woman pulled it off, and everybody else could stay home. It was much neater and cleaner, more efficient, right? We didn't have to go and fight wars and have armies. We just did it. And we also saved the Jews. And there was another miracle. So the women are saying, there's Hanukkah of the Hashmonaim, and then there's Hanukkah of the women. And the Hanukkah of the women is something that we are going to take note of by not doing malacha while the candles are being lit. Now, I say to you again that there are other reasons. We're not learning. I'm cheating a little bit. There are other reasons given in the halacha for the women not doing malacha during that time. I know that. We're not discussing them, but this reason is also given. And what I want to understand is why it is that the women, or that anybody would think that you have to also celebrate Chanukah for some other reason, nothing to do with Chanukah. Some other miracle, some other great victory, some other moment in history where the Jewish people were saying, Vus mission rein Yehudit. Why do we have to mix in Yehudit, who may have been a wonderful woman and done a great thing and pulled the caper of all times, but why do we have to put her into Hanukkah? I mean, it's not Hanukkah. It's not Hanukkah. So what I'm asking is, again, why are we so concerned about the miracle to the exclusion of the history? And I don't mean to say that we don't know that there's history. I think we do. But we seem to be much more concerned about the miracle. Furthermore, I say to you that the women are not only concerned about the history, about the miracle, but they said, well, there's another miracle. There's another miraculous event that we would like to include in Chanukah. We would like to make it part of Chanukah. Not the history, but more miracles. More miracles. And perhaps I would point out to you, as I said before, that the relevance of miracles for religious people is not eminently clear. It's not eminently clear. If you believe in God, in other words, it seems to me that the miraculous event has proven itself incapable of creating spiritual dedication. It's rather the spiritually dedicated who see the power of the miraculous event. And we all know that that is true. I mean, you know very well that Kriyat Yamsuf, that the splitting of the Red Sea, made a profound and overwhelming effect on Jews. I mean, for us, this was the proof, as the Ramban says. The Rambam has to relate to this question. I mean, again, the different systems that they worked with are not our concern. But this proved God's intervention in history. If God intervenes in history, so God exists. If God intervenes, God created the world, right? I mean, this is the foundation of everything. Kriyas Yamsuf, Yitzias Mitzrayim. And yet, you know very well that it did not have the same effect on the Egyptians. Because we don't know of a case in which a miracle, in which Jews and non-Jews participated, had the effect on the non-Jews, on the non-believers that it had on the believers. Chanukah, the miracle of Chanukah overwhelmed us. We can't get over it. We light Hanukkah candles, and we think about it, and we work on it, and we're concerned about it, and we see it as being one of the most remarkable events in world history, and there's no evidence that the Greeks stopped being Greeks, that the Hellenists stopped being idolaters, that they looked around and they said, wow, look at that oil just burning for 8 days. I mean, let's change our worldview. So that miracles have historically, it seems to me, proven themselves irrelevant for creating the religious personalities. Miracles rather are the expression of the vision of the religious personality. That is to say, if there is God, then there is a miracle. If, chas v'sholom, somebody says there is no God, then there is just unexplained reality. Do you follow what I'm trying to say? I mean, a miracle doesn't prove anything to anybody. I mean, what could it possibly prove? I mean, what does it mean? I mean, how do you know that something's a miracle? I mean, if you sat here, we're sitting here in this room, if this house started floating away, we all saw, looked out the window, there was a window. If it floated a little, there'd be a window. But look how we see Kiryat Moshe down, below us someplace. So what would you say? What would you say? Well, I tell you what you say if you were raised and educated in the world of today, the world of causality, the world of science. I mean, what would you say? You'd say, hey, how'd they do that? Isn't that what you'd say? I mean, you might get a little nervous, like, what am I doing flying around here? But, once you sort of like calm down and ascertain that we were safe flying around, we would say, how did they do that? How did Avner Levi manage that one, How did he get us to float here in the middle of the air? That's what we would say. And then, if somebody walked in through the door and said, it's a miracle. It's God expressing his ba'alut, his ownership of the world. What do you say? Lock him up? Lock him up? Is that what you'd say? You say, there's a victory, a war is won. Bisman Hazeh, right? The Israeli army wins a victory against the overwhelming odds. What do you say? It's a miracle. Well, maybe it's a miracle. Well, let's wait and see. Let's see how it works out. Let's give it another 400 years. I mean, how do we know for sure exactly what happened? In other words, we're trained. We're trained basically, we, the religious people, are trained to be a little skeptical, right? We're skeptical about things, but we're not skeptical about science, right? We're also trained, like we're trained. That's how we're trained. Be skeptical about miracles and unskeptical about science. It's like if you read, I remember, I bring this example sometimes, but if you read, I remember when I was a kid, used to read in the New York Times, the first page, they show a picture of some guy who just won the Nobel Prize. He says, for discovering the particle in the nucleus of the atom that has no mass, has no energy, has no spin, there's no way to determine that it exists, and he just won the Nobel Prize for discovering it. So, not even a second of doubt. We wouldn't dare. You wouldn't dare think somebody's putting something over on you, right? That here somebody's getting a prize for discovering nothing, right? But even though I don't understand at all what is being said, it doesn't, mean anything. Fine. So our training is scientific in that we tend to believe things that are presented to us scientifically, and we tend to be skeptical about things that are not presented scientifically, such that we are skeptical about the notion of miracles. Even we who are halachic, religious people. And so the point that I was trying to make is that miracles are basically worthless in proving a religious position, because it takes a religious position to recognize a miracle. I mean, who recognized the miracles? Only the bubbas, right? Only the grandmothers recognize miracles. Because only the grandmothers are willing to commit themselves to a religious position. But you can't go to somebody and say, hey, look at this miracle. Be religious. I mean, you just can't do that. Because they'll say, how do you know it's a miracle? And this was already pointed out to us by the Rambam in Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah, when the Rambam said that even Yetziat Mitzrayim and all the miracles of Yetziat Mitzrayim would not be sufficient to prove the veracity of the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because the Rambam said, even though the people who left Mitzrayim believed Moshe Rabbeinu, and they accepted him as their leader, and they were certain and they were confident that he was telling them the truth, and they would accept the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu. Even without Ma'amad Har Sinai, they would accept the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu, but when they would come to tell their grandchildren, listen, this is the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu gave it to us. I mean, he's the guy, and they say to him, well, why do you believe Moshe Rabbeinu? They say, well, he took us out of Mitzrayim. They had all these miracles. He always did good for us, He helped us out, and then he gave us a Torah. So the grandchildren immediately would say, well, have you ever heard of Velikovsky? I mean, who says? How do you know it was a miracle? I mean, maybe Moshe Rabbeinu was a good guy. Maybe he did good things, but maybe he also had like a literary bent, and he wrote the Torah. I mean, how do you know? And that, the Rambam says, was the reason that Ma'amad Har Sinai had to be done in order to convince everybody experientially, not through the miracle. Ma'amad Har Sinai was a miracle, but it wasn't the miracle of it that was important, it was the experience of it that was important, such that every single person could say, I know that the Torah came from heaven. How that happened exactly is a different discussion, but the point that I'm trying to make is that it was well known in the time of the Rambam and the Ramban that miracles are of very little value. That miracles are not that which creates the religious world, but miracles are rather the result of the religious world. Miracles are the way religious people look at things. Because a miracle is a statement about God's intervention. And the only people who can speak about God's intervention are religious people. And non-religious people, or people who don't have that worldview, but have a scientific worldview, for example, they look at things and they say, well, I may not understand it, but that doesn't mean it's a miracle. So that miracles have no value, none at all, in producing the religious personality. But miracles are rather the evaluation of reality that's made by the religious personality. It's the religious people who speak about miracles, because that's how they see the world. Not because there is a point at which miracles are obvious or clear. The Rambam says that if the Torah says that Kriyas Yamsuf was a miracle, so it was a miracle. But that's because the information in the Torah is true, not because I can assess it as such. I don't know. The Torah says, Ruach Kodim Hazah. There was a big wind that came along. Who knows? I mean, left to my own design, I could possibly devise a kind of physical way of understanding Kriyat Yamsuf, the splitting of the Red Sea. But the Torah says, no, it was a miracle. So it's a miracle because I believe in the Torah. So that it's the belief, it's the emunah, it's the spirituality, it's the conviction, the religious conviction of the person, which enables the evaluation of miracle to be. And I think that this distinction is very important. So, when I put the Chanukah menorah in the window, and I say Pirsum Hanes, I say I'm advertising the miracle. I'm announcing the miracle. I'm not announcing the miracle at all. I mean, there's no point to that. It's of no significance. I mean, to whom am I announcing this miracle? What I am announcing is that we have not changed. That we have not changed. That we remain the people who see reality as an ongoing miracle. That's what the Pirsum is. I am saying there, by announcing there is a miracle, there was a miracle in the Beis HaMikdash, then I'm saying something about myself now. What I'm doing is announcing to the world what it means. What it means for us to be Jews, and what it means for us to be frum. So that it's not so much that we deny the historicity of events, nor do we say that there is no interest in discovering what the lines of the attack and retreat of the Hashmonaim against the Greeks who are in a particular battle that took place at a moment in history. No, it's very interesting. Quite the contrary. It may even be fascinating to study that which indicates what they were up against. How the Hashmonaim managed to do what they did. Fascinating. It may even indicate for us ways of action in the modern world. May have all sorts of implications. I mean, important. But Chanukah, when I come to say to the world what it is that I'm commemorating, what I'm commemorating is a vision. Is the ability of people who are involved in Olam Hazeh. And there is no greater involvement in Olam Hazeh than being in a war. There's no seedier side of reality than warfare. There's nothing which is on the surface of it a less spiritual activity than participating in a war. And I'm saying that we who participate in reality remain or retain the capacity to see a miracle. So I'm not announcing to all those people out there who don't believe in miracles that there was a miracle. I mean, that's kind of foolish, meaningless, purposeless. What I'm announcing to them is that I think there was a miracle. I saw a miracle. That's who I am. That's who I am. What I'm saying to them is, no, I know what Chanukah could be if you are in charge of Chanukah. I know what you would think about, how you would remember it. I remember it differently. I remember it as a religious person remembers history. And the way that religious people remember history is that somehow history is a partnership between our enterprise and divine will. And the lighting of the Hanukkah menorah is a statement, not about what happened, but about who we are and the way we see it. Now there's a Gemara. The Gemara is in Yuma, Masechet Yuma. A little bit of a strange Gemara, Daf Kof Tes Amud Aleph. You know that there is a connection between that chapter in Psalms that begins Lamnatseach al Ayelet HaShachar. Ayelet HaShachar, right? The morning star. And Esther Hamalka. And Queen Esther. And this chapter is all, of Psalms is a chapter that we read or that we say in prayers on Purim. Omar Rav Yossi, Gemara. Omar Rav Yossi, Lama Nimshila Esther L'Shachar. Why was Queen Esther compared to the breaking dawn? Ayelet HaShachar. Lomar lecha, in order to teach us, Ma Shachar Sof Kol Halayla, Af Esther Sof Kol Hanisi. Just as the dawn ends the night, Esther was the end of all miracles. In other words, there's the miracle of Purim, was the last miracle in the world. No. I mean, Rav Yossi was an Amora. And he knew all about Chanukah. The Gemara says, Va'ika Chanukah. Says, what do you mean? Esther was the last miracle? I mean, we don't know the dates perhaps exactly of Queen Esther, and there may be some argument of a couple of years about the dates of Chanukah. But one thing we are fairly confident about, and that is that Purim happened long before Chanukah. Long in terms of hundreds of years. Like a Chanukah, so you have these kind of Gemaras, like you have a conversation in the Gemara, which we kind of feel should be a conversation between people of great intelligence and knowledge. And then you have Rabbi Yossi says Purim was the last miracle. But the Gemara goes and asks Rabbi Yossi, says, what about Chanukah? He's like, what are these guys talking about? I mean, this is it. I mean, I have to be here and overhearing a conversation in a Gemara about, reminding Rabbi Yossi that Chanukah also exists. I mean, like he was in Purim. He already forgot about Chanukah. So he says, no. I'll tell you what I mean. I didn't mean that there's no Chanukah. I didn't mean there's no Chanukah. I meant nitno lichtov ka'amrina, which means given to be written down. That's what I'm talking about. That's what the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi says. So let's listen again to what Rabbi Yossi says. Why is Esther called Shachar? Because Esther is the end of the miracles. What kind of miracle came to an end with Esther? The kind of miracles that are written. Where are they written? Where they're written in the Torah. Oh, not in the Torah, in the books of the prophets. Not in the book of the prophets. In books that were written by Ruach HaKodesh. Right? Whether we call them Torah or Nevi'im or Ketuvim. I mean, basically, they all have this kind of underlying similarity or connection that there's Ruach HaKodesh involved. Certainly, the Ruach HaKodesh of the Torah is much greater than that of Nevi'im or that of Kesuvim, but we're talking about special books. So Rabbi Yossi says, Nitla lichteva ka'amrinan. He says there is the miracle of Esther, and the miracle of Esther still could be written down in a sefer, and that sefer could become part of the canon, part of the Tanakh. And if you remember the Gemara at the beginning of Megillah, Esther Hamalka fought about the holiday of Purim, and she fought to have the book written down. And it wasn't clear that the Megillah would be actually part of the Tanakh, and it was accepted. So that Esther represents for us the end of a period in which history can be represented in Torah, in written Torah. And from then on, history has to be represented orally. And what's the nafkamina? What's the distinction? What's the distinction between Purim and Chanukah? Therefore, according to this Gemara, the Bnei Yissaschar says as follows. Chassidus, the Chassidish word, but we are all open-minded, right? So the Bnei Yissaschar says as follows. It says, when you read the Torah, you know it's from God. When you read the Chumash, it doesn't have to say. It's a miracle. You know the trees are a miracle, the grass is a miracle, and Avraham Avinu is a miracle, and Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Yosef, and David HaMelech, and Shmuel HaNavi, and Esther HaMalka. I mean, we know it's all a miracle because it's there in Kedusha. It's sanctified by Torah. I don't even have to really know exactly how to delineate the miracle. I don't have to know where it began and where it ended. I don't talk about Esther HaMalka and say, well, you know, she was on a train going from Eretz Yisrael to Paras, and something happened, they could have gotten derailed, but it was a miracle she got to Paras so she could be brought up by Mordechai and finally marry Achashverosh and save the Jews. I don't have to know all of that. I know. I mean, even if I don't know exactly, I know. I mean, it's a Megillah, you write it on a piece of parchment, and the Sofer writes it very carefully, and you read it in shul, and you make a bracha. I mean, you know, we know that it's special. It's the evidence of God's relationship to the world. That's Nitlo Likose. Means that Esther was still Torah. She was still part of the Torah, and she comes to me. The information that Esther was Esther Hamalka, that Esther was part of the divine plan, it comes to me because it's right there in the Tanakh. That's how I am. That's what I know. But Chanukah came to me at a different time in history. Chanukah was created when Torah was no longer being written. And the story of Chanukah is only what I make of it. It's all Torah Shebaal Peh. And therefore, the story of Chanukah is the one that creates the problem. The story of Esther doesn't create a problem. In Esther, I can talk about beauty contests, and I can talk about makeup, and I can talk about good guys and bad guys, and this and that, and a goral, a pious, a lottery. I can talk about actual idolatrous activities, but it doesn't matter because it's in the Torah. That's what the Bnei Yissaschar says. Will somebody think for a minute that we're not talking about God's activity in history? Lo yitochen, so it's Hester Ponim, so what? It's hidden from us. We don't always see God directing it, but now that it's in the Megillah, it's there. When does the problem of the secularization of history come up? When it's not written in the Torah. Then somebody comes and says, listen, Chanukah, it's a story. How do you distinguish before Chanukah from after Chanukah? How do you distinguish this political activity from that political activity? I mean, how do you know that the story of Chanukah should be sanctified? Maybe the Hashmonaim were not such good guys. Maybe they took the kingship against a halachic position. After all, they led to the eventual destruction of kingship in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, how do you know? Full state. Where is it written? Where is it sanctified? B'Kisvei HaKodesh that there's Chanukah. And so on Chanukah, as opposed to Purim, on Purim we can tell the whole story with impunity. It doesn't bother us and we have nothing to worry about because it's all there in the Megillah. And there are halachas about the Megillah, and we know that the Megillah is in the Tanakh, and therefore the whole story is obviously part of the divine plan. But Chanukah, we could have a difference of opinion perhaps. Maybe people will say it's history. So what do we come and say? That even though lo nitna likosev, that's what the Gemara is saying, and the interpretation of the Bnei Yissaschar, that even though Chanukah was not written down in a Megillah that became part of the Torah, even though we have no source, which is Torah, to teach us that Chanukah is God's action in history, we know it to be so. That's how we have conquered history. And the way we make the statement is by saying it's a miracle. And the way we tell everybody who we are and how we understand Chanukah is by telling everybody that we remember the miracle. So the miracle was that which gave us an opportunity to state who we are. And that's why Chanukah needed a special miracle. In order that we should be able to say who we are. And so the women came along on Chanukah, and they said that Chanukah is the time when we make a statement about history, and we say that even though it looks to others like history, we know that it's a miracle. And therefore we insist that we want to remember other miracles of a similar nature. We know that Yehudis is not Chanukah, but Yehudis is history. And what does Chanukah teach us? That history is a miracle. And therefore, and that we as Jews are obliged to pass this lesson on. And if Chanukah is the time that is dedicated to passing on that lesson, that history, what looks like history to others, is in fact for us an ongoing miracle, then we, the women, say that other history can be included. And that Chanukah does not necessarily have to be the holiday of a particular event. But we can expand Chanukah to include all of history. And we can say that the neiros that we light, that commemorate the miracle, are a statement of our vision in history. And so we also include the history of Yehudis. And we may even include all history from Chanukah, from the end of the written Torah until today, when it became incumbent upon us to see the world, the oral world, not the written world, as the ongoing story of God's intervention in history and our ongoing ability as religious personalities to recognize that intervention. That's the story of Chanukah, And that's why the women insist that Yehudit is part of that story. We light the candles in order to spread the light. The light that we spread is the statement about ourselves. That we insist, in spite of the fact that there seem to be other possibilities, we insist that that which looks like history is in fact the ongoing miracle of God's presence in our world. Finished.
Tell your friends, anyone you think might be interested about it. We welcome your comments, suggestions, and contributions to help us do more of this work. We hope to meet you all personally in Jerusalem, and shalom from Jerusalem.